It's another great day for Argo Unpacked. Today, we're going to be jumping into diffing. How does Argo CD do it and get you some results that maybe you don't always expect? That's going to be a big topic for our panel. We've got Andrew Block. We've got Gerald and Andrew from Red Hat coming on to talk with us about that. Of course, I'll be joined with my co-host, Ruby Tal. But before we do any of that, I have for you a little treat. This is going to be a tip of the week. All right. So this week, before we get into diffing, I want to tell you something that might shock you. Argo CD is the only way to really know what's going on with your Kubernetes cluster. I know that sounds like blasphemy. People are going to say, that's not true. That's not true. I've got kubectl. I've got Prometheus. I know all the things that are going on. But here's the deal. Inside of Kubernetes, we have these wonderful things called custom resource definitions. And these custom resources that are managed by Kubernetes can have their own life cycle. Now, what's really cool about that is you can say like, hey, I want to have a custom resource for a Postgres database. And it's going to have a whole life cycle that runs with its own controller and its own status and whatever. But Kubernetes doesn't actually give a bunch of custom definitions for how these things should be treated from a health check perspective. So if the custom resource is deployed, so meaning the manifest has made it onto the cluster, then Kubernetes is kind of like, did my job. This is some other controller's problem now. Well, Argo CD is packed full of custom resource definition health checks. So we have all these, I shouldn't say definition health checks, but we have all these custom resources that are defined in Argo CD where people have written custom health checks using Lua scripts to define what all of these custom resources statuses mean. Does it mean this resource is healthy? Does it mean it's pending? Does it mean it's progressing? Does it mean it's in an error state? All of those things are built into Argo CD. And we have had, I think there are over 100 now, different custom resource health checks and resource customizations that have been added to Argo CD. So when you just look at a Kubernetes cluster and say, hey, I got all these manifests, I've got all these custom resources deployed, how do you know if those custom resources are actually healthy? Well, the truth is the only way you can really do it is by using Argo CD, because Argo CD has all those things built in. I think it's a bit of a hole in Kubernetes. Honestly, I think it's something that should be built into Kubernetes, but because it's not, we have all these great custom resource health checks that have been built into Argo CD. So a cool tip for you all today is to know that those things are built in and you can add your own. So if you're writing your own custom resources for Kubernetes, you can actually write your own custom health checks in Argo CD and you can add them to Argo CD so that anybody that deploys your custom resource is going to get the correct view of the status. Is it healthy? Is it progressing? Is it an error state? All of that is visible. Whereas when you don't have that kind of, when you don't have those health checks in place that Argo CD does, sometimes it can be a little confusing to know what's going on with those custom resource. So that's your tip of the week. Thanks for tuning into Argo Unpacked. We're going to jump into a conversation around diffing. Let me bring in my co-host, Revital. Revital, welcome back.
Thank you, Dan.
And we're going to introduce two legends. These are guys who have written a couple of books on how to use Argo. They're no stranger to the stage. We've had them come speak at ArgoCon numerous times. They're great guys. Gerald is, of course, also an Argo maintainer and does a lot of contributions there. Andrew is a maintainer on Helm. So let me bring in Andrew and Gerald. Thanks for coming, guys.
Anytime. How are we doing, everyone?
So we've got a little bit of news just to remind everybody. ArgoCon Amsterdam coming up March 23rd. I'm going to be there. Revital's going to be there. So you can come hang out with us. Gerald, Andrew, are both of you making it? You're usually there. Gerald.
Not for Amsterdam.
We got Andrew. All right.
Yeah.
As long as we got Andrew, we'll be okay. So you can come hang out with all of us except for Gerald at ArgoCon Amsterdam. We'd love to see you. Come tell us how you're using Argo CD. Tell us what's working. Tell you what you like about the project. Tell us what's terrible about the project. We love to hear it. We love all that feedback. And if you just want to talk shop, anxious to do it, we'll be ready to do it. Revital and I will be mostly at the Octopus booth. We'll be also in between the Argo booth. We'll have an Argo project booth at KubeCon the rest of the week. And of course, you can just find us on the show at ArgoCon during the day. So go register for that if you haven't yet already done so. And if you want to come see us in ArgoCon Salt Lake, those CFPs are going to be opening soon. So start thinking about what talks you might want to bring to the fore. And one other piece of news, it looks like we're going to be able to do a sort of mini Argo day at KubeCon Japan. So if for all of we've got a ton of Japanese audience members to Argo Unpacked. I'm sure that 90% of the audience right now is Japanese. But if for you folks, we're gonna have a presence in Japan. So start thinking about what talks you'd want to submit for that as well, because that's going to be coming up real quick. So all of that news is out there. Andrew, Gerald, Revital, any reactions to the Argo tip or news that you'd like to share?
The Argo tip, definitely +1 on the custom health checks. I think I've written like 3 or 4 with the different custom resources that I have, especially since, being at Red Hat, we have OpenShift has its own set of CRs. We typically have to create a couple CR health checks that are specific to the OpenShift custom resources.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yep. +1 for me too. I mean, I'm usually telling Red Hat customers that having health checks in Argo basically gives you free monitoring, because you put an alert on an application and those will automatically bubble up to change the status of the application, those health checks. And then you can send that to Slack or whatever notification system you want, right? So you don't have to write a bunch of Prometheus queries yourself for those CRDs. You can just do it in Argo and get it all.
That's a serious bonus tip right there, is to set your alerts on the application status and let the CRs take care of themselves. That's a great one to point out, Gerald. And I actually asked Michael Crenshaw about this a couple years ago, because I was reviewing some PRs for people adding custom health checks. And it was like, Bango database. I'd never heard of it before, and I'm like reviewing the PR and I'm like, well, it's Lua. It looks correct. Doesn't open any back doors, so I guess I'll give it an approval because I'm not going to deploy this custom resource for it. And I asked Michael, I said, like, should we go push Kubernetes to go build this stuff in? Like, why is this something that people have to add into Argo CD? And he was like, they probably should. But on the other hand, it's a great differentiator for Argo CD because it's something that we could do that nobody else can. And it's kind of this hidden gem that people that use Argo CD often just take for granted. They don't realize how much value they're getting out of it on that end. Well, let's jump into today's topic. So we're going to talk about diffing. And diffing is something we've talked a bit about on this show before. And maybe I would introduce it, Andrew, by saying that there's essentially 3 levels of diff in the Kubernetes world, but we're going to be introducing kind of maybe a 4th one to talk about Argo. There's the difference between dry manifests. You've got a Helm chart that's being compared to another Helm chart, but they both have not been rendered yet. There's the rendered difference, so you actually run values against them. And then there's also a server-side difference where when you apply that to Kubernetes, there may be mutations that happen once it gets actually deployed. And then in between those, there's kind of the way that Argo CD does diffing, which is a little bit different and sometimes surprises people. And I think, Gerald, you've said people come to you and they're like, hey, why doesn't Argo CD just give me the normal 3-way diff that I expect from everything else? So if that's enough of a tee up or a frame for you to go off of, you can take it.
You actually mentioned it earlier about, are you going to submit a CFP to the upcoming ArgoCon? Well, it was a CFP that Gerald and I decided to create sometime for the KubeCon North America last year that kind of got us to really digging into this topic. And I know I learned probably way too much about diffing than I would have expected. Gerald, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really coming from the point of view, like when I started with Argo, as Dan mentioned, you're thinking, why isn't this just doing a 2-way diff? Like, why does this have to be so complicated? And I think, Andrew, you said it well when you said, well, that's Kubernetes, everything's complicated. And really, a lot of it comes out of Kubernetes in terms of having to deal with different field managers, different controllers, modifying things in the live aspects that requires a much more complex and nuanced solution. But we did this basically because we see all the questions in the Argo Slack channels about why isn't my manual edit showing up as a diff, for example, right? Why isn't this showing up as a diff? And, conceptually I understood why, but I really wanted to dig into the semantics of the behind the scenes, why this was happening.
Well, and it is something that people aren't used to because even if you're coming at this from a GitOps perspective, maybe you use Flux or something, you don't see diffs in Flux like this because Flux really only tracks a release object like the Helm chart version. And so it sees if there's a diff there and it's like, oh, this isn't the Helm chart version that's defined in Git, but it doesn't deal with server-side mutations at all. You won't see those things. If somebody goes and modifies a resource that's managed by Flux, you won't see it. But in Argo CD, you do. And so everybody, I mean, as soon as they start using Argo CD, they they realize that they have to add some ignore differences when they want to delegate something. But then from a feature just perspective, diffing is probably the most important feature. Very, very common pattern. As soon as people use Argo CD, they start with maybe manual sync so that they can preview a diff and they can click sync and know what's going to happen. And then once they feel confident, they move to an automated syncing. So how does Argo CD handle the diffing differently than what people would normally expect?
I think a lot of it comes down to the different strategies that are available in Argo. You have a couple of different ones to choose from. You have one that's out of the box, and you have one, some that you can decide to choose from. I know, Jared, you said you were going to kind of talk about some more details about each one. I know you had some ideas about some topics that you were going to start with. Do you want to start with that?
Yeah, well, just to kind of circle back, I mean, there's kind of 3 diff strategies in Argo right now. There is the client-side diff, which basically mimics kubectl diff out of the box. There's the server-side diff, which mimics kubectl, but you do the -server side to it. And then there's the structured merge, which is being discontinued in Argo, but is still, I believe, the default for server-side apply. And that is using the upstream structured merge algorithm from Kubernetes. Under the hood, Argo CD, unlike when it applies, is not actually running kubectl to do any of these diffs. It does the diffs itself. in code, but it's using the underlying kubectl libraries. But it makes some tweaks along the way to do different things when it does the diffs, and those tweaks are important to understand as well.
So that's not part of the code base that I've spent a lot of time in. So what are some of the reasons that it diffs, that Argo CD diffs differently? If you diff differently, then your diffs get differentiated from.
Sure. I mean, an obvious one is the tracking, right? Like when Argo inserts the tracking, either label or annotation, and hopefully everybody's using annotation now that it's the default, because label really needs to go away. But you don't want that showing up in diffs, right? It's just noise for the regular person. So Argo will remove that for you automatically in terms of doing the diff. So there's a few things like that. And I know in the 3.2, 3.3 series, they're kind of tweaking back and forth on some of these things. I haven't had a chance to really go into depth, but examples like that is where it comes into play, right? Like generation is another one. Nobody cares that generation changed, but it's just noise to people, right? So Argo is trying to take away some of that noise, so that you get a diff that really revolves around the content that you're interested in.
Yeah, resource generation, I've seen cause some heartburn for people, where basically, like, every time a resource or a related child resource is updated, it updates the resource generation on that Kubernetes resource. And so it's like a status changed from like not ready to ready, and it updates that number, or like replicas change, or there's just a message that says, hey, everything is fine, and it changes that. And that causes some people to have heartburn, because they're like, wait, something's changing on my cluster, but it's actually not. It's like, yeah, we expect that. It can be a sign of something going wrong if it's like really crazy, like there's some kind of resource flapping thing going on underneath, but generally it's just fine. So maybe another element here is like this legacy client side diff. You're basically doing, it's a three-way diff, right? So it's from the rendered manifest against the server side manifest. What's the third?
Not the server side. The live manifest.
The library.
Live manifest. And then the third is the last applied annotation that it's diffing against. And then it doesn't merge between those two.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's pretty reliable. I mean, I don't think we have a lot of issues with it, but that's a good point, that Argo CD actually replicates basically all of your Kubernetes state inside of Redis, so that we can do all these diffing in a performant way, because otherwise we would be hitting the Kubernetes API like crazy, and it would be a lot slower. But it's pretty quick. I mean, you don't see, like, it's uncommon to have that Redis cache be really out of date from Kubernetes.
I have a very basic question. You said legacy client-side diffing. Does it mean that we're moving toward the server-side diffing and client-side diffing won't be available anymore? Or it will be another option of doing the diffing?
Well, actually, coming out of this talk, we were actually, because coincidentally, there was another talk at ArgoCon right after our talk that really focused on the server-side diffing topic. And one of the areas that the maintainer of that issue, where really that talk worked through, is the creation of an issue to change the default from the client side to the server side.
Just a small thing on that. It's actually to change the default from structured merge, which right now is
structured merge, right?
Yeah, to server side. I know what you meant, Andrew.
Yeah.
Wait,
we know where we're going. We know where we're going. Now where we are.
Yeah, explain the difference between structured merge and regular server side.
So as mentioned, structured merge is using the upstream structured. If you go look in Kubernetes repos, there's a structured merge library that basically will do a diff based on the structure, i.e. the field managers that are present, right? So it will say, for example, ignore anything that's not in a field manager that's relevant for the merge that it's doing. Server-side diff does the same thing, but the structured merge doesn't take into account the live state in terms of mutations and things like that, like a server-side diff will do, is my understanding. The structured merge is being problematic. There have been various issues raised with it over the years, and there's a PR that Peter and Leo have for making the server-side diff the default for server-side apply. And then once that happens, structure merge will hopefully just go away and be removed from the product at that point. Client-side diff will never go away. That will always be there. I don't see any reason why you would remove it. But as we move more towards a server-side apply, server-side diff world, I imagine it'd be less and less used.
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons why people would want to use server-side apply. One, you can just handle more a larger manifest. You don't have to worry about last applied annotations taking up space, which like a lot of times when people were used to install Prometheus for the first time, it would be like they couldn't apply all the manifests to it. They needed to switch it to server side apply so they could get enough memory to even just apply the thing. But the other is, like you said, controllers running that are doing mutations that you're not going to see otherwise. So like, Kyverno, for example, adds annotations to resources by default. Very common for people to then go and just ignore those so they don't have to see them. But if you're trying to do a diff and see what exactly will change and you want a full answer, you have to do it server side because those resources can mutate in surprising ways. I mean, it all comes down to what the user has set up, what they've set up in Kubernetes. But you could, in theory, make a mutating webhook that really mutated the heck out of everything that was getting applied and make it totally different. And unless you're doing server-side diffing, server-side apply diffing, you would kind of never, it would show up incorrectly.
Yep, that's absolutely correct.
I mean, ultimately, diffing is all about just avoiding surprises and having a source of verisimilitude, knowing what's actually applied, right? Because like back in the day, if we just took Jenkins, we put it on a cron job and we told it to watch a Git repo and said kubectl apply every 20 minutes, you're kind of doing part of GitOps. You got Git as a source of truth. It's being regularly applied, but without knowing what's actually happening to the live state, you don't know if there is any diff to even deal with.
I mean, that's really where GitOps really takes hold, is the diffing, because one of the reasons why you do GitOps is to ensure if there's a divergence between your desired state, you are able to get it back to your expected state. I go in and kubectl a resource, modify it. You want to go back to what's defined in Git, and understanding how it, what it looks like is a key part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So the other part of this that might be a threat to diffing is this move towards doing the rendered manifest pattern. So the rendered manifest pattern allows you to render those manifests and commit them to a Git repo. So you can do a diff directly, between these Git repos in theory to get pretty close to that live state. Do you think that we'll see less pressure on diffing in Argo CD because of the rendered manifest pattern, or do you think it just solves a different problem?
I don't personally. I don't know, Andrew. How do you feel? I can elaborate, but
for me, it's more. There should not be a difference whether you render the manifest in Git or you do it live and render them on the fly. There really is no difference. You still need to perform a diff between the live state and your expected state.
Yeah, and that's it exactly. I mean, the render manifest pattern is great for change control because the people, doing the approvals and everything can see very close to what it's going to look up. But as you noted earlier, Dan, it's not going to take into account things like mutations and other things that could be running on in cluster. It's not going to take care of Bob making changes on the cluster on the fly, things like that. So I think the Argo diff will still always be needed.
Yeah, I mean, because if you're only comparing against two Git folders or Git sources, you are only comparing between two things that are supposed to be deployed, but you don't actually know what's actually deployed. So you still need that Argo CD side. Another point that we get into when we talk about diffing is application sets. And this is one that bites a lot of people in the butt, where they modify an application set and it's kind of tricky to figure out what that's going to do. We did introduce back in, I want to say 2.14, the ability to preview application set changes. So you could do that client side, and you can say, hey, show me what this is going to do. And you could render the applications locally, and you could then run a diff on those and figure out. But then that's actually one layer removed from the question you really want to answer, which is, what does that mean for the manifests that are going to be applied? Because it tells you the answer to the application definitions, what might be different. But then you actually have to go through and render each of those applications individually to figure out.
And that's really where the real value of diffing is that, last mile.
Yeah.
Because that is going to be basically your last, line of defense before applying the resources to the cluster.
And I haven't seen anything. I mean, I haven't seen any plans from anybody who's trying to make a feature that when you modify an application set, that you would be able to see the manifest differences that would create all the way down. Because it's kind of computationally expensive. I mean, you imagine it's generating 1,500 applications. You got to go then render all of those. You got to run diffs on all of those and spit that back in some kind of format that would be valuable. But just as a user, you would think like even just to get a number of like, this is going to make 1,600 changes. You're like, oh, maybe I want to go double click on that and figure out what it's doing.
I wonder though, Dan, if that's an argument not to have things specific in the application itself, like, a Helm chart parameters or value files or customized overrides. It's hard to avoid completely though, because, I love the cluster generator and be able to throw secrets on or labels and annotations on the cluster and then drive deployments based off of those things. So it's kind of, mixed feelings on it, but if you avoid doing that stuff, then the diff becomes trivial because again, you're just differing the manifests themselves, right? You don't care what the application set actually generates at that point.
Yeah, if you were waiting for us to mention the anti-patterns blog post, you can go ahead and take a shot now, because that is one of the anti-patterns is don't use parameter overrides on applications. But there is kind of this exception for, like you said, dealing with application sets, because you are generating off of values. It's the design of the thing is that you would have some potentially parameter overrides, not necessarily always. And if you can avoid them, it's better, right? Because then you can, and usually you can have that stuff just live and get for most of it. But but like you mentioned, there's some logic there.
I'm fairly pragmatic. Like in OpenShift, we have the concept of a wildcard ingress, and every cluster has a different one. And you could have 100 overlays for an application if it needs to be deployed across 100 clusters. But pragmatic me says that's ridiculous. I just want something that's going to let me substitute in the wildcard when I need it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, makes sense. Now go ahead, Revital.
One question about best practices. Are there any best practices in terms of the scope, whether you should use the server side on an application scope or on a global scope? And how does ignore differences basically affect those decisions?
Pretty sure that came up during our actual talk.
That's why I'm smiling, because I think Andrew and I disagreed on this one.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Andrew.
I trying to remember what I actually said back then. I'm usually at a non-global scope just because it's a little too invasive, because a lot of teams I'm working with are going to be a lot of the Argos I work with are either multi-tenant or potentially have multiple consumers. So doing so more on an application level gives more of the flexibility. But Gerald, what are your thoughts?
I tend to prefer global where possible, but after thinking about it a bit more after the presentation, Andrew, I probably align more with you, just because things aren't quite full. I don't want to say they're fully baked, but it's a relatively new thing, and there's a period of adjustment to get used to it. There's also the fact that server side will put a little bit more load on the clusters, although they do a lot of caching, extra caching now to try to mitigate and mediate that. So it's another thing to keep in mind. We get a lot of customers complaining about API pressure in Kubernetes. So
I think also another piece here is to go ahead and experiment, see which strategies will work with your teams. Everyone's Argo CD deployments are somewhat unique. Your organizational structure might be different than others. So see which works best. You start at global, or start at the individual and see which works well with your teams. If you see a need, or you're starting to see patterns where there's no need to worry about the differences between application level versus the global level, just do it at the global level. It's much simpler.
Yeah, I think from a behavior standpoint, I'm pretty anxious about the idea of making server-side apply default because it does change the behavior a little bit. And so if you have, you've got thousands or tens of thousands of applications and suddenly they all switch to server-side apply, you will have things that happen that you don't expect. And I don't know that anybody's written like, here's what to expect if you did that. Because I think there would be some stuff that would be surprising. So, but server-side apply has a bunch of things that it does that are really valuable. You can have field level ownership that's going to be respected. And so you have more granular RBAC where you can say, hey, this field is owned by somebody, this field's owned by somebody else. And you can have Argo CD play in that world, and that can be really useful. It's got better conflict resolution between resources. You get more feedback when you apply it. So like if you do a client-side apply, that I think it does a check that's essentially like, hey, is this valid YAML? If it is, it's applied. But when you do a server-side apply, it's doing a little bit more work to check the values that are passed. And so server-side apply ends up being better. So it's not, I don't think the argument is even from the perspective of like, do we think one is better than the other? I think we do think that server-side apply is probably better, but from changing the defaults perspective, it feels like a breaking change almost, because if you just rolled into that, suddenly you're getting a whole bunch of things popping up that are just different than what you expected. That could be.
I definitely see there being a bit of a burn-in period between when you switch between something that is dramatic in terms of the differences versus what's currently there currently.
Mm-hmm.
So then are we saying that there aren't any specific guidance on when to use each specific diffing techniques?
No, there's definitely guidance. So I think a big one that Andrew and I found interesting is that you should always match the diff strategy with the apply strategy. So if you're using server-side apply, use server-side diff. If you're using client-side apply, use client-side diff. If you cross-match, you will get some edge cases that are kind of interesting and resulting in unexpected.
We certainly found some of those edge cases unexpectedly in many ways.
Yeah, and this is just what fields being garbled or lost or added.
Well, the server-side diff knows nothing about last applied annotation, right? So it's calculating based on field manager. So you get some diffs coming out of that way, and vice versa. When you're making changes based on server-side apply, you don't have that last applied annotation anymore, and client-side diff is essentially like blind, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you want to make sure that you always match the apply and the diff strategy, like never mix and match them.
And then as far as like when to use one over the other, I mean, we mentioned like server-side apply if you're low on memory because your manifests are very large. Server-side apply is probably going to work better for you. It's because it has it doesn't have to worry about a bunch of fields that we do have to care about when we're doing the client-side apply.
The big thing is the last applied annotation. The annotation, you can store a lot of information there, but it has a limit, and you get a really big thing. It will not fit in there and it will fail with client side. So that's really where server side apply shines.
Yeah. And then when it comes to the diffing of if you don't have any controllers or mutations happening cluster side, then you probably don't need server side diffing. Therefore, you don't really need server-side apply as much. But if you do have controllers running, and most people do, it's going to be more accurate. And I think there's a little bit of we are all kind of chasing like the most accurate diffing of what is and what isn't possible. Even though client-side apply is good for it's great 99% of the time. That 1% of the time when it gets you, I mean, that's a challenging thing to debug because suddenly you're looking at it and you're like, look, there's no diff here. Like, what's going on? Why doesn't this look right?
I mean, this is where development environments really take hold. Why you want to make sure you do proper testing, verification, so you don't get any unexpected gotchas or oopsies in a prod environment.
Yeah. The nice thing with server-side diff too is essentially you rarely need ignore differences anymore.
When you're using server side,
Server-side apply and server-side diff, yeah, you don't need ignore differences anymore because you're not, as you mentioned, you're not having to account for those mutations. So again, in OpenShift, we have this thing called a route that you always have to do an ignore difference on with client-side apply that you don't need to do with the server side.
When we render the manifest in Argo CD, if you're using server-side apply, does it do a server-side render?
It'll do a dry run before it does the diff.
So it does a dry run server-side.
Yes.
And so it would capture all those mutations
right
in that rendering. And then that's what it uses as the source for its diffing.
And that's another big benefit is that you find out if there's a problem ahead of time. Let's say you've got a validating webhook, right? And it's going to fail. The client side, you don't find out till it actually tries to apply. With server side, you find out on the diff.
Yeah. That's a great point, actually, that you don't need as many ignore differences. So Kyverno, to go back to that example, Kyverno will add annotations to resources. It does a mutating webhook that updates those, and it's putting in information about how Kyverno is going to apply to it. And it's just annotations. But if you're doing client side, you have to have an ignore differences. Otherwise, you'll always see that as a diff. But if you're using server side, it's going to render with a dry run server, and it will show those annotations. So you will see that there's no difference. Even though your source of truth doesn't contain those annotations, it's understood that they're going to exist. And so it doesn't show the diff. Which can also be confusing too sometimes. I mean, if you have you're like, hey, wait, that's not, this field is here, but it's not inside of Git. I almost wish that we had a feature in the diffing UI that was like, let me select what diff I want to look at and give me the full bird of the default, but then also let me see these other things because I want to understand what things are being added by controllers. Maybe it's something we should color code. Oh, these things are being added server side versus the things that are exist within the manifest itself. There's a hydration aspect to this.
Yeah, and just to be clear too, it's not just about controllers. The other thing with server side is it takes schema into account for all those, going back to your tip, the custom resource definitions, right? So if you have defaults, for example, server side is much more aware of those than client side is.
Oh yeah, this is another case where we've seen issues where what's the format? There's a format where client side, you can pass a value as a 0, but then server side, it calculates as null or something. I can't remember exactly.
But they're specific around custom resource quantities in Kubernetes that can be a little funky too.
Yeah. Oh yeah. You can have a quantity that's a number and you'll pass a 1 and server side it'll be 1.0.
Correct.
And
there's a call out. Yeah.
You'll see that as a diff, and you're like, oh, that's a stupid diff. That didn't help me at all. So that's another thing here is that you get kind of these false negatives, I guess, with client side diffing that you don't get with the server side. It's just always going to be more accurate.
Dan, if I remember correctly, ignore differences is one of your favorite features.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Totally.
I have a video. I think it's the most popular video that you created, the most popular short.
Well, so okay, this is actually an argument against server-side diffing as well. It's both an argument for and against, right? Because when you do an ignore differences, you are basically setting a very explicit, I am delegating this field to something else. And you still need to use it, even if you're using server-side diffing. Let's say you have a pod autoscaler. It's changing the replica value server side on the fly. That's going to be, let's see, if you use that with Argo CD and you were using server side apply, wouldn't that replica controller get out of date because the controller changed it? It would only happen in between states, I guess, because it's going to render with whatever it's supposed to have. It's not going to be responding. Anyway, it's a confusing edge case. But if I want to make sure that if I want to understand each controller that's changing something, then using ignore differences allows me to basically say, hey, I'm delegating these things to these controllers. Whereas if you just do server side apply, you are by default saying everything that's happening server side is fine. So that eliminates a class of diffing. So if somebody went and changed a value on the cluster, then of course that would show up as a diff. But if a controller is doing it and it's rendering with that always, then you don't see the diff. And so there is maybe an argument to be made that, hey, you should explicitly write these ignored differences, because then you have to make sure that you understand everything that's happening server side. Whereas if you don't understand what's happening server side, maybe there are controllers doing things that you don't want and don't expect that don't show up as diffs now.
Yeah, I'm kind of pondering that myself.
Yeah, think about that. Yeah, do you think maybe we're like reasoning this out right now? Because
I'm a fan of normal configuration, so I don't really generally like having 1,000-line ignore difference in my Argo configuration to handle all the situations. But from a compliance point of view, I guess it could make some sense maybe in certain cases. But Kubernetes by its nature is a very controller dependent environment, so yeah.
I think a lot of it just comes down to having proper documentation into the controllers that are deployed to your clusters and what they do enforce or act upon.
Yeah, like you as long as people know that those things are happening. But like I said earlier, I almost wish that we had a feature that was like highlighting which fields were being modified server side to tell you that, like, yeah, this is by the way, some controllers doing this. And
you do, though. The field managers show up in the resource, right? You can see exactly.
I think he's saying to visualize that a little more apparent in the Argo side. Is that what you think about, Dan?
Yeah, because it's doing it from a field manager perspective, but we don't show, like, in the diff. I don't think that it shows like I don't think it like highlights like, oh, by the way, this is owned by a controller.
It's actually kind of, I think, a little bit worse than that, because it really only cares about the Argo CD controller. So it doesn't really care what the other field managers are doing when it does the diff.
Yeah. So, maybe, I mean, I'm kind of talking myself into client side diffing being valuable for some of these things in a way that, again, it just depends on what you want, right? Like,
yeah, for sure. And like we said, I don't think client side diff's going away anytime soon. So it will always be there as an option.
Yeah. Well, do we think there's a next step for diffing within Argo CD? I mean, we talked about the challenge of potentially going to a server side diff as a default. Do we think there's another layer of diffing that we need to bring into Argo CD, or some future, or I'm not aware of any work being done for some new diffing features right now?
No, I don't think we need different features. I think a lot of it just comes down to how do we visualize or make it easier for users to understand where the differences are emitting from or originating. Why do they occur? And just allowing end users to become self-aware and being able to then potentially bubble that up into different systems so we can do it in an automated process.
Yeah. Well, and ideally, like, even though you can have a lot of these mutations, some of them probably should live in Git rather than always being server side. Like, you can have a default value that is what you expect, but may get modified, right? So, like, your replicas, right? You would pass, oh, I expect I'm going to have, 5 replicas by default, but it's going to get changed up to 10 or 20 or whatever. But there should be like some kind of default value that is generally the one that you want, that is correct. Because, like, in theory, if you could apply all the manifests directly, injection webhooks kind of change the need for ordering in Argo CD, right? Like, a lot of controllers, if they're just using an injection webhook, will modify the resources when the resources are created, but not when they're already existing. So if you add the controller later.
I mean, it also becomes interesting when it comes to diffing, because if you look at Carverno, it does not only admission time, but it also does additional reconciliation after the fact.
And I don't know how common that is for controllers. Is that do you think everybody does that, or is
No,
a lot of
most don't. If you look at just admission controllers and mutating controllers, those occur at admission time, versus there's a reconciliation that occurs routinely that Kyverno supports.
So Kyverno is the outlier here in supporting that additional functionality.
Well, but is it? I mean, Andrew, for me, I guess you have to kind of mutation is one thing, but then you also just get regular controllers or operators, right, that are constantly updating the CRs that they manage.
But a lot of times that's going to be on the status field, and that's going to be a sub resource.
Good point. Yeah, I hate the ones that insist on managing the spec and changing that.
Yep.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, there's definitely like that's almost another topic to dig into. We could have a whole show just about like the state of custom resources in Kubernetes. I had somebody one time, I was visiting their company, and they were giving like an internal they were doing like an internal meetup, and they were explaining that everything that they deployed was now a custom resource, and they were like really proud. They were like, yeah, we've got like over 1,800 custom resources for representing each different thing that we do. And I was like, I don't know. I mean,
CD is going to have a whole lot of fun.
Just use those. Why do we have to? What? You have to make everything needs its own life cycle that's special. Can't just be a pod or something.
You could definitely have too much abstraction.
Yeah, doesn't that sketch you out? The idea of somebody having like 1,500 CRDs.
I more worry about the different operators that have to go ahead and controllers that have to manage that, and the API pressure you're going to end up running into. I wonder if that's something that those individuals have not thought of initially and will feel the pain later on.
Yeah, I wonder if they use a shared controller. They just keep on adding to it, and I don't know what the pressure. Because the other scenario is like more terrified, right? Is that you have 1,500 controllers additionally running that you have to like keep track of, and if you mess it up, your Kubernetes cluster like stops updating properly,
or it just falls over.
Yeah.
I
mean, in OpenShift, it's very controller heavy. Like I just checked my cluster and I'm running in the background here, and it's got like 225 CRDs in it, as an example, right?
But those are like open. A lot of those are like OpenShift CRDs, right?
Yeah, they're OpenShift CRDs, most of them. But if you bring up a regular Kubernetes cluster, you'll see a handful of CRDs by default, right? In comparison.
Yeah. That is a lot. Yeah. But if I don't know, I'm less anxious about it if Red Hat is maintaining it. You know what I mean?
It's our problem now.
Yeah, it's like you guys probably tested it or like keeping track of it. You have some sort of plan. Whereas if we're doing it in-house, it's like, are we really going to be able to bring like the level of attention and detail needed to run these hundreds of controllers or thousands? And I don't know.
I just worry about,
Go ahead, Andrew. No, you go ahead, Andrew.
I always worry it's just a creator of CRDs. Am I doing the right thing? A lot of us are just learning on the fly through testing, experimentation, and hearing what the other folks in the community are doing. Having to run at that scale, especially just for a typical organization, is a little bit scary, to be honest, because most don't have the maturity to be able to manage Kubernetes at scale.
Yeah, it's its own discipline. Well, actually, so Andrew, let's ask from you're a Helm maintainer. So from your perspective, is there any special knowledge around Helm and this diffing? I mean, ultimately, we're just rendering the Helm chart anyway, right?
There are actual.
Just a good chance to mention, if anyone have any question, feel free to post it in the comments, and we will answer those questions.
Oh yeah, we're watching those.
Yeah, from the Helm community, there are actually some plugins. So one of the key areas of Helm 4 that we worked on was around our plugin system. There is a specific plugin that is specific to diffing between two different components. So, that's certainly one that the Helm community can certainly see more of if there's really a need to look deeper into the Helm side of things.
But we don't support the Helm diff function in Argo CD at all, right?
No, not that I'm aware of now.
So that'd be an extra layer of diffing if you run the Helm diff command.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but I don't think at the end of the day, this is one of the benefits of Argo CD is that we render the manifests. So it doesn't matter if you're using Helm or whatever else. Of course, we've talked about before, Argo CD doesn't support like Helm value lookups as part of the security model, though you can do it through a CMP, but you super shouldn't, so don't. But also, we did make an example of that one time. Just don't do it. But do look at it. It's cool, but don't use it, to be clear.
Yeah, I have very mixed feelings on not supporting lookups. Again, as a purist, I understand the reasons behind it, but as a pragmatist, there are times where that lookup would be extremely handy to be able to have access to it and use it for deployments.
Yeah. Well, technically, I mean, if you're running a controller that injects some values anyway, kind of don't even need it anyway. Right? You can still do that. You can still do these modifications server side, and they'll be respected as part of your diffs if you're using the server side diffing, right?
Yeah, but essentially, instead of fixing it in one spot, aka Argo CD, we're seeing 1,000 customers. Now you have to solve this problem on your own.
That's true. Yeah. But if we solve it in Argo CD, then we have to change the security model because we have
absolutely. I see both sides of it. That's why I say the purist in me is like, yeah, don't do that. And the pragmatist in me is like, oh, that'd be useful.
Yeah. No, it's definitely useful. Well, we're getting towards the end of our show here. So, Rovital, do you have any other questions you want to bring up or topics?
No, but I think we can have another session about server-side diffing in general.
Maybe go a little bit deeper on it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, when we talk about diffing, another thing here, there have been a lot of talks about when you should be diffing. So, like, I'm making a change to my application, and we had, I think, Dag on to talk about. He had made a GitHub action that basically spun up a cluster with an Argo CD on it to run rendering and stick it as a comment inside of the GitHub pull request. It does feel like that is something that's needed, because when we started talking about this use case, so many people start with manual sync so they can preview the diff. And once you get confident, you move to auto sync, you kind of lose that. So you're only looking at diffs on dry manifests, typically in GitHub. If you use the rendered manifest pattern, then of course you can look at it rendered there. And I actually haven't looked. Does rendered manifest pattern respect server side apply?
I believe so. I don't see why it wouldn't. I mean,
Yeah,
it's independent of the rendered manifest.
So it'll render with the dry run against the server.
No, the rendering is completely independent of the cluster.
Yeah,
because all you're doing is you're just rendering it ahead of time, committing it, and then just applying it using the kubectl directly instead of having to use a templating engine by Argo.
I don't think rendering with server side apply is going to be super efficient or with a dry run.
Yeah, and it introduces security problems.
Well, and then you get all of the fluff manifests and the stuff resource as well. Hey, there's your generation, there's your UID, there's all this stuff.
Yeah.
Are you going to strip that out before you put it in the upstream Git?
Well, sketchy. Yeah. Well, I hope everybody has enjoyed this discussion around diffing. We grateful to have Gerald and Andrew to come on and talk about it. And if you haven't caught their ArgoCon talk about this, it is on YouTube. What was the name of the talk?
What the diff?
What the diff?
What the diff? All right, so you can watch the What the Diff talk just on YouTube. And see the whole thing and get the very structured approach. This is more like the backstage behind the scenes commentary edition in the podcast this week. As always, don't forget to subscribe on X, on Blue Sky, whatever platform you're using. We're on LinkedIn. A lot of people love tuning on LinkedIn because it gives you this preview of when the next show is going to be. It makes it very easy to join that way. A lot of people like X too because they're just already on there. So whatever works for you. We do have a website, which is argounpacked.com. Feel free to go there. If you want to see any topics, let us know. Ping Rovital, tag her in it. And she's tracking all the work that the team is doing across open source and contributions they're making, which is monster. So yeah, let us know what you want to hear about, and we'll talk about it next time. I think our next show, we're debating if it's going to be on President's Day, which is a holiday in the US, or if we'll do it the day after. I think we'll probably end up doing it the day after or skipping a week, but we're going to have Christian on. And what are we talking about with Christian, Rovital?
Project Labs.
Argo Project Labs. All right. So plenty more coming up. All of that stuff on Argo Unpacked. Thanks everybody for joining us. And as always, stay synced.
Pond 5.